Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this, the final of the 2011 series of the Dean's Lectures. A popular event indeed, and I recognise that there are graduations happening, and the fact that you've come out with Elton John performing is a great testament to what you want to hear and what you are going to hear. This is, of course, John Hattie's inaugural professorial address because he joined the Graduate School of Education earlier this year. And these are public lectures where the university requests their new professors to make a public lecture so that following their appointment. But I am pleased that you were able to find us. For obvious reasons, we did have to move the theatre. This is definitely a new record for Dean's Lectures, so thank you for your support. And we've just started a few minutes late because there are some who missed the communication that had moved from Queensbury Street to here, so we just thought we'd give them a chance to arrive, so there will be still people coming in. But I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional custodians of this land, and I pay respect to the elders both past and present of the Kulin Nation and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present. For those who haven't been to one of these lectures, just in terms of format, we have a vote of thanks at the end, and I've asked Professor Colette Taylor, who's our Professor in Early Childhood Education and Care, to do that, and the reason I've done that is that John Hattie was Colette's PhD supervisor. But afterwards I will invite you to come upstairs because we have provided refreshments. So now it gives me great pleasure indeed to present Professor John Hattie. We know the topic, the future assessment. John Hattie has researched this area for many years. He gained his doctorate at the University of Toronto in psychometrics. And a theme throughout his subsequent career has been the application of measurement ideas and methods of study of educational questions. This theme has allowed him the luxury of moving across many areas, quite diverse areas, such as self-concept, study skills, evaluation of national parks, evaluation of the US Marines, adolescence in prisons, teacher quality and models of teaching and learning. Throughout, the constant theme is quality assessment. Now, it seems that he spends about 10 years in each of his working locations. First New England, then Western Australia, then North Carolina, and then Auckland, and now here. So I'm looking forward to your next 10 years, John. To keep with this numbers theme, I just will note he's published 400 articles, he's presented 400 papers, he's supervised 175 thesis students, he's received $37 million in grants, he's written 16 books, he's passed the 10,000 citation mark, and there's a lot more to come, John. He's currently serving as the President of the International Test Commission, being advisor to various ministers. He's been Associate Editor of the British Journal of Educational Psychology, a past editor of the International Journal of Testing, and on the editorial boards of 18 journals. He was chair of the New Zealand equivalent to the research assessment exercise. But also, he's been president of the Auckland University Cricket Club. He remains a part-time coach and an umpire, and it's absolutely clear from last week's results that they're missing him already. He's been awarded the Hedley Bear Award for Writing in Education from the Australian Council of Educational Leaders. He's won University Teaching Awards for Teaching, Innovation and Supervision. He's been elected a Fellow of the American Psychological Association. He's won Computer and Technology Awards, and this past year made an Order of New Zealand for his contributions to education. So now he is the Director of the Graduate School's Melbourne Education Research Institute, an acronym of MERI. So it's now fitting for me to introduce the MERI, Professor John Hattie. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Field, and thank you also for coming. And as Field has indicated, my background has been in measurement in the psychometrics area, and it may not sound a too sexy a subject, but I want to share you tonight what I see as the passion in this area. I think we're at the stage in the measurement community when we're on the cusp of major breakthroughs in this area. It's been languid for many, many years, as I wish to show you. And so what I want to do tonight is to present an argument about what the state of assessment and measurement is around the world and where it could go, and to hopefully give you a perspective of the kind of exciting things that happen under this title. I want to start right back at the beginning, and as we know, for millennia we've been doing assessments, and as you see, the Chinese system invented it mainly to solve a few problems with nepotism and cheating. So they introduced the civil servants exams. At the turn of last century, there was a major breakthrough in assessment when Spearman and Galton and others came along and decided that the way in which we see assessment is indicating you observe kids' performance, you observe their behaviours, adults, children. There is some error associated with that, and then when you take that into account, you can get a good index of what the true score of an individual is. Now, this particular model that my colleague Barry McGaw many, many years ago likened to the sailing ship model, and he did that because it still exists in every classroom here in Melbourne today, is the classical test model. A model that's almost 100 odd plus years old, as I want to show you in a moment, surpassed many, many years ago, but it's the dominant model. And as Barry indicated, it's simple, it's elegant, and it's been durable. But it has major, major faults. When you create any assessment using this model, two of its problems are the quality of the test is only as good as the other items in the test, and the person's score is only as good as the other people who sit the test with that person. That's absurd. But that's the dominant model that serves most of our school systems today. In the 1950s, a new model came out to do test analysis called item response models. And certainly the point of this slide is to say it's been around 50 plus years. There's probably not a measurement institute in the world. As Field pointed out, in my job at the International Testing Commission, all the services, the ETSs, the ACERs, are members of the International Test Commission. There's probably not one of them that doesn't use this model. There's probably not one system around the world that doesn't use this model. But it's not the model that's used in classrooms. So whilst we've known for 50 plus years that the classical model is kind of wrong and bankrupt, this new model has been around, we haven't used it. Part of my message today is how we can do it. You only need three things. If we know what the difficulty of the item is, if we know how good it is discriminating between kids who are very good and kids who are not so good, and if we know what the propensity to guess in the item is, we actually can model kids' behaviour very well. We have very, very good ways using this particular model to predict with high levels of probability what kids' scores are, which is certainly not true with most of the classical models. And as you can see, this new method allows you to do things like take two tests that look different, smell different, and equate them so they are comparable, which surely is absolutely critically needed if we're going to measure kids' growth. It allows you to detect if items are biased in favour of certain groups, Aboriginal, lower socioeconomic status, but females, male, etc. It allows you to do adaptive testing, where when you administer an item to a person, depending on the result of that item, the system will then choose an item that's appropriately more difficult or appropriately easier, depending whether they get it right or wrong. And it can do many other things, such as with personality and attitude tests. And I want to paint a picture of how you can actually use this in classrooms every day. In the last 10 years, we're moving beyond the sailing ship, speedboat, the spaceship kind of models. We're now starting to get a lot more information from assessments, particularly about the time it takes kids to complete items, their cognitive processes, how they actually go about thinking as they do items, to get away from just measuring surrogates of ability or IQ, and also the many dimensions they have when we go to do a reading item or a maths item. And from that, we can do some quite remarkable things, particularly with essays scoring, which I want to come back to, and also in terms of how we report the information back to teachers about how kids are thinking as well as what they thought. Now, to get to what I want to paint this evening, which is the work I've been doing over the last 10, 12, 15 years in assessment, I want to build a case to get there. And each of the parts I build, you will see during this session how we then implemented it. Let me start with the inevitable the technology revolution, which is the revolution we've been having for the last 35 years. If Alexander Graham Bell came back 15 years ago, I bet he could walk into any room, the phone would ring, he'd pick it up, and he'd say the word that he invented, hello. But I bet if he came back today, and he took an iPhone, it's quite a different system than he ever imagined. If we look at what's happened in schools, and someone came 200 years ago, and Rip Van Winkle-like came back today, I bet they could teach, they could do everything that modern teachers do with few exceptions. They would see very, very similar. And part of the message is, how do we get beyond many of our current systems of teaching? Not because they haven't worked, they kind of have worked. But our kids are going to leave us behind very soon if we don't start thinking differently about the nature of how we teach, and obviously my argument's going to be, and use assessment to make that difference. For instance, one of the things that we've been playing with is we've been taking glasses, and for $100 you can buy these. They have a video in here, and they have sound on the side. And yes, we can put them on a teacher, and we get the teacher to run a class. And one of the things we know, for example, is that experienced teachers look at all the kids roughly equally, 4 times an hour. Inexperienced teachers tend to choose the same few kids all the time, and it happens to be the kids in the front and the middle. But more interestingly, that's not very exciting. What we do then is we pause and say, okay, teacher, let's now look at the video. And every teacher I've met can wax lyrical about what happened and why it happened. And then we say to them, oh yes, 3 of the students had them on. Let's look at the same lesson through the students' eyes. The silence is deafening. One of the major themes I want to put to you tonight is assessment is primarily feedback for the teachers. It isn't about feedback to the students. In some ways, it obviously is feedback to the students. But my major message is moving our whole assessment thinking about how we can get teachers to see learning through the eyes of the students, such as we're doing with the glasses system. When you look at those kind of software applications, they almost feel kind of dated, don't they? They're about 5 years old at most, but we're moving on. Let me pick up virtual realities. One of the other things we've been playing with is video assessment. And we've created this video, and the irony today is I wasn't brave enough to show it today in case the technology didn't work, where the student watches a kid get off a bus, go into a school to sit an exam. And as they go through various things, the teacher telling them to set up and get their pencils out, etc., it pauses every now and then and turns to the student, the person sitting the assessment, and says, well, what would you do in this circumstance? And gives them options. And so we did this, and it takes about 10 or 15 minutes for the students to go through this. No question that they preferred it. They much preferred this kind of assessment, not all of them. But the interesting thing and the frustrating thing is that it actually doesn't give you a hang of a lot more information using many of these fancy tools. And I think one of the frustrations I have at the moment is so many people are getting into using fancy tools that kind of give you the same information if you didn't use the fancy tools. But one of the things that you may pick up from this is that at the bottom half of the distribution of people, in this case in reading self-confidence, there is more information. And the assumption is that some of these new methods that we are starting to use in our schools may be advantaging some of our lower ability kids. And surely that's a good thing. And certainly as I've done the analysis in my last 12 years in New Zealand, I'm sure it wouldn't happen in Victoria, but it is overwhelmingly the case that primary teachers dramatically underestimate what kids can do. And so maybe if we could start to give some of this to up their sense of expectations through the assessments, we might actually end up with a better system. I also want to mention a piece of work that my colleague Patrick Griffith is doing. And I just think this is also part of this, the kind of message I want to have tonight. He's decided to see if he can work out how you can assess collaborative problem solving. Now he can sit in his room and he can see a kid in Singapore, in Victoria and in Finland collaborating together on a problem-solving case and working out each person about how they go about collaboration. Now here's the exciting part. Very recent, Patrick indicated to us that PISA, the national assessment across about now 50-odd countries, is introducing his assessment in 2015. So if nothing else, Australian schools will suddenly care a lot about collaborative problem solving. And those of you, as I'm sure all of you are in the room in the workforce, that's a pretty necessary skill to survive in our workforce, isn't it? So we are breaking through these notions, and I think Patrick's doing and his team doing stunning work in that area. In the 1990s, we changed how we thought about tests. We used to think of tests' quality in terms of how good the test was. It had high reliability and alphas and psychometrics and blah, blah, blahs. In the 1990s, they came along and said, no. A test is as good as the interpretations you make from it. Now, it's taken a long time for us in the measurement community to fully grasp that. But I certainly take it on and very strongly argue that a test is only as good as the interpretation. Of course, not only the interpretation by the student, but particularly, I would argue, by the teachers. So what are the actions that follow from any assessment? And that's the criteria I want you to think about as I show you what I've been working on over the last year. The argument I'm making, in about 7 or 8 years ago, I published a book on visible learning, which is not my theme tonight, even though you'll see the connections, because as a measurement person, not often do you get people coming to hear assessment people, but they like to hear about other stuff. So here's my chance to bring them together. And my argument in that book was that if you look at the literally thousands of things that people have done to ask what makes a difference to kids' learning, the essence for me is that teachers, school leaders who believe that their fundamental job is to evaluate their impact. That is what dominates the top of the effectiveness charts, is how we can make this learning visible to the teacher. What is the impact they're having? Let me just give you a brief flavour of that work. What I did, and I have to say it took me 20-odd years to do this, real squirrel behaviour, was try and locate 50,000 plus studies that looked at what made a difference to kids' learning and try and put them all along the scale. And what I was trying to look for is what was up here compared to the middle, obviously worry if it's low, down there. Now the reason I started this is that everywhere I went, my colleagues told me, this is what you do to make a difference to kids' learning. And then you went to schools, and every teacher told me, this is what you do to make a difference to kids' learning. And they all differed, but they were all passionate about it. In fact, have you ever met a teacher who says they're below average? That's not what our kids think. So I said, well, can I understand the relative effects? Now what I did is, I now have about 240 million kids in the sample size. Not a bad sample size to answer this question. There's not much I don't have in terms of what influences kids' achievement. Yeah, there are some things, but not a lot. But the message tonight is that if you average them all out, on my scale, they average around here about 0.4. Now, the details is not that critical, but it's certainly not the 0 point. We have quite an impact on kids' performance. And when you look at 240 million kids, and you look at the 0 point, there's not much we do to kids that harm them. Kind of good news. In fact, 95 to 98% of things we do to kids improves their learning. In fact, all you need to improve a kid's learning is a pulse. Everything works. And I bet tonight, we have 3 ministers of education in Victoria, so one of them's going to go to bed and wake up tomorrow morning with a new idea. It will work. And my frustration are teachers who say, look, this is the performance of the kid at the start of the year when I got him or her, and this is their performance later. I've improved their learning. They have set such a low standard, they cannot fail. 240 million kids, it's not a bad normal distribution. There's the average, my 0.4 on my particular chart. And I would suspect in Australia, the graph would be very similar to this, slightly up. In fact, I know it is, because I've analysed the NAPLAN scores and it comes out exactly the same. My concern is what's up here compared to what's down there. And hey, you know this. Do you want your kid and a teacher who systematically gets effects up here or down here? Our profession has to start to realise that our benchmark is a lot greater than the 0 point. And part of my theme is, how do we come up with assessment schemes that tell teachers, principals, in regular, systematic ways, the impact they're having on kids? There is oodles of people in this town that every day are having these kinds of effects. My worry is we don't have very good systems out there to identify them, so we put the great unwashed and talk about teachers. And I'm certainly not ever arguing it's teachers who make the difference, because there's just as many teachers down here up here. But these are out there. These are in our system. These are in our schools. How do we use assessment to dependably not only identify them, but also they know their impact? And I want to go a step further. We have a massive dialogue in this country about standards, national standards. Well, there's a dirty secret, guys. If you take any achievement area, there is a normal curve. It is just not possible for everyone to be above the average. It's not possible to get every kid above the standard. The UK showed that. They went from 52 to 75% at and above standard, and they considered themselves, the schools had failed because they didn't get 100%. We are not going to get 100%. But hey, no one has the right to send a kid to school and expect a teacher to make them an Einstein or a Madame Curie. But they do have the right to send them to school and get a year's growth for a year's input, at least. And that's the year's growth, on average, here in Australia, using NAPLAN results. So how do we switch our dialogue from standards, which ultimately will mean, unfortunately will mean the only choice for parents is flight out of the public school systems, because those are the ones that are in the media. How do we switch from that discussion to growth, where many of our public schools and others are having stunning success with all kids? And the thing I like about this is that those growth measures are reasonably uncorrelated with socioeconomic status. You can get growth right across the distribution. Let me give you a bit of a flavour, 3 slides. I've got 150 altogether of different influences, and you can see the things that we shouldn't worry about. I suggest to you that these are probably the debates that we have the most often. We love to talk about the things that don't matter. Now, Field's sitting here, and he's going to get very upset that I don't comment on teacher education, and he knows my view. Teacher education, as we commonly know it, in my opinion, is the most bankrupt institution I know. And one of the reasons I was attracted to Melbourne is it's one of the 18 institutions in the world that gave up that bankrupt model and is trying a totally different model. And that's another session we should have about the success of that. You can see, on one hand, Field, it's not hard to beat. On the other hand, we have to do dramatically better. You can see some of those other things. Those are the things that don't matter. This is kind of the average effects, and I like this for a couple of reasons. I put a couple of testings in there. You'd probably say, why is he talking about testing? They're below the 0.4 average. And yeah, that's true. Because so often our testing is about giving information to students about how well they go, not to teachers about their impact. And Colette, I didn't know you were giving me the thanks afterwards, but I'm pleased I got it. And you can see early childhood is on there. If we don't get the effects in early childhood are double those, if we don't get it, it's damn tough to make up for it afterwards. And at the top, it's fascinating that the very top thing, if I said to you now, look guys, I'm going to give you a test on everything you've been listening to for the last 10, 20 minutes. But before you do that test, I'm going to ask you to predict your score. What that says is kids are brilliant at that. They know by about age 8 where they fit in the hierarchy of schools. And so often they then seek information to justify where they fit. The clangor is, most kids, most university students, perhaps some of us, we set expectations that are safe. Remember those times when you're at university and you had a really bad night and you think, oh my God, if I can get a C tomorrow, I'll be doing really well. Or the students who are typically the B average students, very happy to get a B again. The message for me there is that the role of schools is never to make of kids. The role of school is never to help kids reach their potential. The fundamental role of schools is to not only make the kids have higher expectations than they thought, and one of the ways we could do that, I would argue, is seeing constantly the impact we have on kids and not just feeding them back assessments to reiterate where they are in the ranking of the classes. And response to intervention is where a teacher puts in an intervention, sets up some kind of monitoring, to see what the impact of that intervention is on kids, and if it's not right, they change the intervention. They don't change the kids. Providing formative evaluation is formative evaluation back to the teacher. Teacher credibility is in the eyes of the students, that the students see the teachers as credibly changing their learning. Feedback obviously is very powerful, and I'll come back to that, as is the student relationship. And that's really critical, because if you don't have a good student-teacher relationship, you can't make an error. And one of the hardest things that we have as teachers is if a kid doesn't know what your teacher's talking about, in many classes, dares that kid put their hand up because of what the peers will say. There he goes again. The old dummy's asking the question. Great teacher-student relationships have high levels of trust, so error is not only tolerated, it's welcomed. Because, hey, the only point of going is to learn what you don't know, as it is to come into university. So error is really one of the most powerful things, and you can see how I'm going to bring that back in terms of the assessment and learning from errors. I want to put in not labelling students and mention that for a moment, because that's one of our most invidious things that we're doing, particularly with the medicalisation of education. And what that says, take two kids of the same kind of behaviours, same kinds of personalities, and you label one, and you know the words. We used to have ADHD, Asperger's, OCD, all those things. You get a 0.7 difference in their learning. The labelling causes it to go down. Now, I'm not saying those things aren't real. So don't come up and afterwards and say, I'm denigrating Asperger's, or I don't believe the frequency, but hey, they're out there. That's not my point. My point is the labelling is a killer. When we label a kid, we often explain why we can't teach them. And we stop then teaching them because they have an explanation. The only response to someone being labelled is for a teacher to say, I can fix it. Not pretending it's easy, but that mental attitude that you can change students and not let the label sit there. Okay, back to my story. The theme of what I'm trying to do is this notion of when teachers see learning through the eyes of students. And that's what I've certainly been working on the last 12 years. Coming here to Melbourne, seeing the work David Clark and others are doing, I'm really keen to get in the bottom half, how students see themselves as their own teachers. Because if you think about all that rhetoric about lifelong learning, self-regulation, or metacognition, all those fancy words we use, that's what it means. When 8-year-olds, 15-year-olds, and 20-year-olds learn how to teach themselves, they've got it. And away we go. But it's the top half that has been my focus over the last years. Feedback. You saw it was right up there. You can see how powerful it is. It's one of the most powerful things. And certainly assessment is feedback to teachers. Of all the things on my chart, it's absolutely there as a common denominator at the top. One of the things I've been doing is to trying to understand it, because here's the problem with feedback. It's also incredibly variable. Some feedback's hopeless. Some feedback's incredibly powerful. How do we unlock that kind of system? And that's what my current last 5 years and what I'm doing at the moment. For example, I'm working with a school at the moment, the Northern Bay down in Geelong. There's 9 schools down there. And they wanted to learn more about feedback. So I did what I've done in many schools. I said to them, before I come down, I want you, teachers, to interview 5 other teachers and 5 kids and ask them, what does feedback sound like and look like to you? And give me a good example of feedback. As happened in Northern Bay, as happened in every place I've done it, the teachers were very clear. When we summed up what the teachers said, they saw feedback as was constructive, some kind of commentary, some kind of correction, some kind of conversation, some kind of did they do the task well. Those of you in universities, I'm sure you'd echo that. And they also argued they gave lots of feedback. And it is the case teachers give lots of feedback. The interesting thing is when you ask the students, they don't see it this way at all. They see feedback as entirely about where to go next. If the information, the communication, the conversation doesn't help you understand where you go next to them, it doesn't exist. And you remember that when you got your assignment back at university. What's the first thing you did? Looked at the grade? Second thing? Tried to see what your colleagues sat? And one of the things we do is we get teachers to sit down with the comments that they spend all Sunday afternoon writing. And then we say, give it to the students, and let's talk to the students. What do they understand by it? That's what they look for. If you don't give them a direction about where they go to next, they don't interpret your words. In fact, they don't remember them more than 20 minutes later. And so how do we get this feedback notion moving away from correction and clarification beyond that? I'm not saying those things aren't useful, they're just the pedestals. The students, emphatically, bright or struggling kids, what they most want to know is, where do I go next? Help me answer that question. Two halves. What we're doing at the moment, this half is we're doing a lot of random controls trial studies, a lot of experimental studies, trying to understand what the best kind of feedback is. And at the moment, feedback that relates to competencies. If you tell students up front what success looks like, and then give them feedback relative to that, that is the most powerful feedback that we know of. And if you saw, remember the slide back a few ago, I had worked examples with a very high effect size. Merely showing a child, anybody, a worked example of what success looks like before they start has a 0.6 to 0.7 effect on their learning. Now, how cheap is that? And similarly with the feedback notion. It shouldn't be a secret. Like, one of my frustrations with most assessment is we give assessment to kids and then we say, what's next? More. We say to them, look, wait to the end of the series of lessons and we'll give you a test and then we'll tell you how well you went. Why don't we tell them up front what success looks like so they can start to judge it? I think a statistic that should worry us is that kids around the Western world spend 15,000 hours in schools before they're age of 15. Last year, for the first time in the US, kids spent 15,000 hours by the age of 15 playing video games. I think we've got a lot to learn from them. What they do, how many of you are addicted to Angry Birds? Yeah, there's a few here, I bet. You know. I'm just coming out of that phase. It knows exactly in a video game what your prior performance is. It knows how to set a challenge sufficiently above where you are to try and attract you to get there. And then it pours the feedback in, of all kinds. And some of you will persist for a long time to get there because you know what success looks like. Dropping those things down. That's the kind of argument I'm making here with feedback. If it doesn't have a sense of success, most of the feedback is dissipated, gets missing. We've also found that social feedback, comparative feedback is okay. Individual feedback, okay. Praise is a killer. The minute you put praise in a sentence, that's all the kid remembers. You know what it's like. Have a sentence with the word but or however in it. They only remember the stuff after it. And when you ask kids half an hour later, what was the feedback someone gave you, they remember the praise. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't praise kids. They want it, they love it. But one of the problems with feedback is it gets messed up in there and it dilutes the message. And so what I'm saying over this side is that feedback only works if we have a good sense of what prior achievement is. If teachers and kids have a good sense of where they're at in the progressions. And if they have a notion of success, then we have a lot of power. So, I want to do backward design. Obviously, I want to start from the notion that we're going to work backwards. And we're going to start at what is the notion of successes. We're going to work on the notion that the feedback is for the teachers primarily. And if teachers constantly seek feedback about their impact, the dividend on the kids is enormous. If we think of modelling the instruction we value, rather than what my worry in Australia is where we're going and hey, America went this way, the UK went this way, most of the European countries went this way. If you have national testing, sooner or later, teachers will learn that their job, and they're paid to teach those tests. And we can't criticise them for that because that's what we ask them to do. That's what we value. And you know how narrow some of those tests are. I have nothing wrong with the NAPLAN system if it assists, as I've been working with some jurisdictions around Australia, to help the teachers understand their impact. It's how we can put assessment into instruction rather than instruction into our assessment. And it's how we can emphasise this progress notion rather than just looking at standards by themselves. How we can turn our system around to say, how good are we at helping every kid in the school make at least, in my words, the 0.4 growth targets. Now, this slide, got a lot of words on it, but it's an introduction to where I want to show you about what I've been doing over the last 12 years to take all what I've been talking up to now and put it into action. When I arrived in New Zealand, there was a big debate in the country about national assessment, and there was a mood to go towards what Australia has done with NAPLAN, the No Child Left Behind and so on. There was an election, and the new government decided, no, we're not going to do that. But hey, we have to do something. We have to understand how well our system is working. We have to know about our cost return. So they put out a request for proposals, and we put in a non-compliant bid and won it. And what we said is, we're going to do this stuff. We're not going to create the typical tests like they do here and administer them every couple of years. We want to embed it in instruction. We want to focus entirely on the teachers. The only thing I argued with the minister at the time was that it had to be voluntary. And his comment was, why would I invest a penny in something that no one might use? Particularly as you're saying it's about assessing the teachers, and Labor Party politicians, you see, you just don't do it. Now, I won that battle. It was voluntary, and I'm pleased I did, because that's one of the reasons it's sustained. It's been in practice now 12 years. It's available to every teacher in New Zealand from year 4 to year 13, 12 in your system. And 80% of the schools voluntarily choose to use it. And they choose to use it because it gives them information about themselves. In fact, for the first 5 years, we gave the kids nothing. It was only to the teachers, and that was its most successful years. After 5 years, they said we have to give more information back to the kids. We do. It's not as successful. We've tried our best to ensure that we get the same impact, but it is about the teachers. Now, the first half of it is reasonably straightforward. You go in, and the teacher can decide at any moment what kind of test they want. And at the moment, it's only in those 6 subjects. And if you don't know your Maori language, those are the 3 Maori equivalents of reading, writing, and numeracy. And the teacher can choose whether the test is between 12 and 60 minutes long. Or in some schools now, the kids can choose it. Curriculum obviously is important. Now in this case, it's reading, and the teacher can choose what they've been teaching. In the new version, they can actually drill down and get specific objectives. A few years ago, we were asked to implement this system in the New York school system. And they were very concerned about their curricula. It was different. And so they should be. And so what we did is we looked at the 150 objectives in the New Zealand reading curriculum, and we mapped them to the New York one. Exactly 150 in New York. We've implemented this in the Northern Territory. There's 150 in the Northern Territory. When you get down to the bottom line, reading is reading is reading. What curriculum people do is they get obsessed about how you group it and make fancy labels at the top. And right in the middle of ASTL, this tool that we developed, they changed the New Zealand curriculum. And in reading, they changed it from its old language, which was inference and finding information, understanding, communication and knowledge, to these words. Good news, at the objective level, we change nothing. We just group them. Sometimes we get over-obsessed about curriculum, and my biggest problem with curriculum, as I want to argue later on, is it's nearly always done by committees and consensus. It's not done on the basis of what kids can and can't do. This is going to feed back to this. It then goes to difficulty. Now what we ask teachers to do is we ask them to indicate how difficult they want the test relative to their kids. Now in the New Zealand system, it's levels. This is about a year, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And there's going to be a feedback loop later on to show the teachers if they've got it right. When we did the analysis of the New Zealand data, we now have 1 million plus kids a year who do this assessment in New Zealand, and they don't even have 1 million kids in the school system. We have got a pretty good database, and when we did the analysis on this, my comment to the government was, the single biggest problem in New Zealand education is that teachers do not have a common conception of progress. Every time a teacher hits a new classroom, it's reasonably random whether the kid will go up or down relative to the teacher's conception of what the appropriate challenge is for those kids. I haven't a clue what it is in Australia, but it's just not good enough that teachers aren't moderated in terms of their understanding of what challenge is in the curriculum. Yes, they do different activities, but that's not the same as challenge. And so we wanted to feed back, and you'll see how that works in a moment. But what the teachers are actually doing there without knowing it is they're actually using modern test theory. They're actually creating a test characteristic curve. That red should be up a little bit. And in a moment, that's going to be really important to where we go in this. Another step. They can also choose now whether it's pencil and paper, whether it's on-screen administered, or whether it's computer adaptive. That is whether the computer's allowed to choose the next appropriate item relative to how the kid answered the item. And it can do other things too, which I won't go into. Now what happens next is the program goes away and it says, okay, we have a criterion. we want a test that fills in that test information curve. And we have a whole lot of constraints. We have a constraint about time, about the curriculum, about the kind of form of assessment, about we have things behind the scenes, like every test must have at least 30% surface and 30% deep, and so on. There's about 20 of them. And it goes into its database of around 10,000 items, which have all been calibrated and blah, blah, checked out, etc., and creates a test. And it does it in less than 7 seconds. There are somewhere between 4 and 600 million tests it can choose from. And so this is instantly available to the teacher or the kid, all calibrated on the same scale. So it doesn't matter in reading if they do a test at the start of the year and a completely different test 8 weeks later and a different test 8 weeks later, they can see progression and so on. That's the test engine. That's actually not so exciting. We're very proud of it because we can create so many millions of tests, but that's not it. All the sizzle is in the reporting. Now, we spent a lot of time on this because if you remember my argument, it's all about the interpretations. And one of my frustrations is that every time you give a teacher or a kid a set of numbers from a test, they all know how to interpret it, and nothing happens. We're trying to minimize numbers. We're trying to maximize interpretations. And this is one that in fact, this was our first one that was aimed more at the principal. What we did is we actually started here. We started with these reports. And we went out to schools and we asked teachers and principals 2 questions. What do you see? And if they didn't see what we wanted them to see, we got it wrong. And then we asked them, what would you do next? If there was no consequence, we got it wrong. In fact, we soon found out that if they said they'd print it, that was the biggest failing question of the lot, because nothing happens. It took us 87 focus groups before we got this one right. We got better at it to pass those 2 tests. Now what you can see here is in this particular school, it's a primary school, years 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. They can do it for a kid level of class, you can neither do. The red is my class, and the blue is the national norms. They can actually fiddle with the national norms and see how they go, the Maori kids compared to Maori, Pacific and so on. But that's not my point today. And you can see pretty obviously there that in this school they're doing well below the national norm. They have information about their surface and deep, their attitude. Look here in year 4, year 5, 6, 7, 8. For 4 years in the school, nothing happened. Now when we first did this to schools, they got very upset with us. They hated us, they hated the test. I said, go and check it out. Across New Zealand schools, in reading, the last 3, 4 years of primary school, it is a flat line. In writing, between the ages of 8 and 16, it is a flat line. The reason is simple. Most teachers stop teaching reading about 8-year-olds. And most of them come up with ways to get kids to learn so they don't have to read. It becomes a bit of a killer for them when they get into secondary school. And what we've tried to do from these kinds of graphs is to convince the government, show back to them their data and say, well, hey, there's the curriculum problem. There was not a clear understanding of progression. And what we used to do in schools, we go into schools and we say, well, let's start by looking at what you teach at these levels. And sure as eggs, they all taught different stuff. Like reading was a classic one. They gave the kids more complicated texts, but they asked the same questions. And it's only when they started to work out how the difference in challenge was did they start to alter what they did in classrooms. This is feedback to teachers at a curriculum level that I think truly makes a difference. This is the kid one. What we've done behind the scenes is we've said, okay, let's take all those 10,000 items and let's calibrate them on the same scale that the kids are at. So in here, you get the concepts in the green zone that, given the kid's ability, these are the items we expected the kid to get correct, and they did. Strengths, these are the items, given the kid's ability, we expected the kid to get wrong, but they got right. Their strengths. These are the concepts we expected the kid, given their ability, to get right, because they're easier ones, but they actually got wrong. And these are the ones we expect them to get wrong, and they did get wrong. Now, 2 things here. Firstly, it's about the concepts. It's not about the items. One of the worst things you can do in the measurement business if a kid makes a mistake with the test item is make them redo the test item. There's no information at that level. It is about the concepts. The other thing about this is the graph that the kids like the most. Like this one here, they love because, hey, they can do it. Just reteach it, please, teacher. It's not that difficult. They love their strengths. And the other part that it says to teachers, if there isn't something in all those 4 cells, it was a lousy test. You don't understand the difficulty of the test. You got it wrong for that kid. If the kid's got everything up in the blue zone, obviously it was too easy. If they've got everything in the green zone, obviously it was too hard. So we've got a visual way of helping teachers create better assessments to give information about individual kids so that they can then go back and know interpretation, make an action about what to teach next. We can then group that up to the class level, we can actually group it up to the school level, and we've even grouped it up to the national level. And again, saying to the curriculum people, like I'll use an example, I'm not sure this is the exact one, knowledge of semantic, syntactic and visual graphic phonic cues. In New Zealand we're not very good at that. Surely that suggests it may be the wrong place in the curriculum, or we need a different way of thinking about it. That was certainly true in the maths curriculum. There were areas that we found out the curriculum had got completely wrong. I don't want to play up that this is all that successful. One of the problems in the maths curriculum, for example, is we showed very clearly that 10, 11-year-old kids can do square root. They can do simple square root notions. The curriculum people said, we've got to stop it. They shouldn't be able to do that until they understand it, and they can't understand it until they've done this. Now, it's not a laugh, unfortunately, it's serious. And my frustration is how come we've let 2 communities emerge, the curriculum community, assessment community, where they're not talking to each other. And I blame partly on myself for not getting the right language to be nicer to these people to say, hey, evidence does matter. Assessment can make a difference to curriculum. And I find it very frustrating. If any of you are thinking of doing master's or PhD students, we actually don't know a lot about how kids progress. We know a lot about how they should, but actually how do they progress in number and in reading? We have a level report where the teacher can find for the various curriculum levels where the kids are. And if this is Colette Taylor here, and she's, say, a level 3 basic here, 4 or 6 months later, if Colette Taylor doesn't move up there, teacher, you're just not doing your job. And the exciting part about this is the teachers wanted this. They loved it. They wanted to know which ones they didn't impact on or not impact on. Progressions. We can actually now monitor kids for 12 years of their school life. Now, the graphs aren't always as clean as this. And the point I want to make with this graph is the red line there is a kid over the last year, up to about here. The yellow line's kind of incidental today. That's the curriculum expectation, the standards, as it were. And we say that's where the kid is. And we say to the teacher, where would you like the target in, say, 3 or 6 months' time? And they put it there. Now, we don't let the kids do this, because when the kids do this, you have to spend all your time saying, no, you set it too high, you set it too low. We let the teachers set it. And what can happen now is the teachers can click on that, and they can actually then get example items of what it means to be at that difficulty. They can get example lessons and so on. Here's the interesting bit, though. What we did is we trialled this with teachers and kids, and we said to the teachers, all right, you set your target. What would you do next? And they said, I'd work out how I can develop the kid from there to up there. Very sensible. But that's not what the kids said. What the kids said is, look, teacher, you want me up there. I know that if I kept doing normally and I'd learned as before and you taught as before, I'd be down there, but you want me up there. Oh, so this is what I have to do up there. Why can't I go there now? Now, when they go there now, many of them don't succeed. But wow, the power for them to want to then get there and overcome that deficiency, because they know what success looks like. And hey, teachers, they also now know what they have to do to fill that gap, because that's the power of assessment, helping fill the gap between where the kid is and where the kid wants to be. And we got incredibly large effect sizes. But hey, the bad news is it's very hard to implement because teachers don't see that as their job. They have all this language about developing and scaffolding and emerging and proximal development and all that stuff, which gets in the way. Not that those things are bad, Steve, but it gets in the way of a lot of what the kids want to do by looking at what success looks like to see if they want to play this game. And the last one is this What Next report. And what that does is it says for an individual kid or a class or whatever, the red dot, that's where you are. In this case, it's geometric knowledge. Now we say to the teachers, look, hey, it doesn't make a lot of sense to keep teaching at that level. One of my pet hates words is consolidation, how we consolidate it. Let's bore the pants off them even more. What we should do is challenge them. And so if you click on those buttons up top, it takes you to a web page and it gives you 10 to 12 teaching resources, 10 to 12 student resources, 10 to 12 open-ended items, 10 to 12 items that you would get at that particular level that you can then frame your curriculum about. What teachers are very good at is coming up with activities for all kids in the class so that every kid can find out exactly what they were doing yesterday and keep going again. What this does is it says, no, you've got to challenge every one of those kids. There are 28,000 teachers in New Zealand. This is hit 50,000 times a month, still, 12 years later. Teachers are absolutely keen to find out what this notion of progression and challenge is. And this is one of the ways that we've brought a lot of moderation into our school system, so that when kids cross our schools now, particularly cross our classes within schools, they're not affected by what's commonly called the summer effect. You've heard about the summer effect? Kids go back in the summer? It's just not true, they don't. What happens, kids get to the end of the year, start of the year, the teacher says, oh, almost a badge of courage, I'm not going to listen to the stuff of the teacher last year. I'm going to spend the first few weeks understanding my students. And what they do is very successfully bring them all down. When we introduce these kinds of models, we don't see summer effects. And what I want to finish with is where we've been going next and the kind of work that I'm doing at the moment. Certainly what we're looking at is how we can use video assessment and essay scoring. Like 10 years ago, there was a massive breakthrough in essay scoring from the old days when we used to measure syntactic clauses, noun modifiers, and all that linguistic stuff to measuring content. In fact, one of the studies that we did is we took the essays that were done by kids, scored by the computer with the feedback. We got teachers to score them and give feedback, and then we blindly gave those to kids and teachers and say, which do you prefer? It was a hands-down misere. They much preferred the computer one because it was much richer in content. It was much richer in what next. And furthermore, the systems that are out there now, kids actually can find out where to go next. In fact, one of my arguments at university level, wouldn't it be great, and we can do this now if we wanted to say to students, we want you to do an essay. And then when you've done it, don't hand it in. Get it marked by the computer. And the computer will tell you what you did wrong, what you did right. It'll actually give you cues to tell you, go and read this. You haven't got a full understanding of this, and history or whatever it is. You have an understanding of that. And do it again. Now, you can do that right now. Now, one of the barriers to that is instructors who believe it's their job to do that. But I think this is an incredibly good example of assessment being used in instruction rather than measuring it at the end. We can look at complexity and start to introduce complexity in cognitive processing and getting better understandings. The model we use is this one. It's very simple, 4 levels. One idea, 2 ideas, many ideas, relate them, etc. Every test has a mixture of those. Every test, therefore, has some surface and some deep. When we analyse tests, and others have done it, and I've done this. When we analyse the NAPLAN tests, others have done this, I've analysed a fair few of the states of America. 92% plus of the questions are surface. Is that really what we want? We can look at progression. Now, the fascinating thing I'm discovering with progression, I'm working with a colleague in Colorado on this, is that progression is actually different depending where you start. How a struggling kid progresses and a bright kid progresses has a different trajectory. And we don't even know enough yet about the average kids, let alone bringing this problem into it. But with all the reporting that we're now doing, we have, over the 13 years, a much better understanding of how kids are progressing through the curriculum. This is the language coming to Australia soon. Value added. Now, there's nothing wrong with value added. It means if you take out prior initial differences like SES or whatever, what value do you add? That concept's great. The problem is that some people, places, states, have used it for a particular purpose. For example, the Los Angeles Times last October printed the value-added score of every teacher in Los Angeles. Now, that's a not undefensible thing to do, but you shouldn't therefore attribute the causality to that teacher. Particularly in high school, the kids may learn more in English by doing the economics and geography class than the English class. So attribution's a problem. But value added is a very powerful notion. I prefer, because it's got a bit of a dirty name before it's even got here, is to talk about growth, which is the same kinds of notions, and that's what we've been building into our systems. Where we've gone since is we've developed the model to go down to years 0 to 4. We've developed an adult literacy model. We can link it to learning management systems. Parents have access to this, and as I've been trying to indicate to you, we're trying to feed it back to the curricula. That's the one we've had least success on. Where we're at the moment is we got a grant a couple of years ago with engineering, population health, and myself to look at health in schools. We have a major problem with kids and health in our schools, and teachers are desperate to find out ways how to deal with it. They struggle, short of, as in New Zealand, checking the kids' lunch boxes to know what then to do. And so we took the line as, what if we could turn it on its head, backward design? What if we could come up with reports of what outcomes look like in health, what progressions look like on health, and then help the schools monitor how well they're going? And we're getting into this in a big way, and partly now we're here in Melbourne and we want to continue this notion of how we can make the breakthrough in health and help teachers understand how to develop curriculum, how to make a difference, by starting with the notion. What would it look like if you had a healthy school? So that's what we've been doing in New Zealand. That's what I've been partly doing in Australia, because we have the system, as I said before, in the Northern Territory. We've offered it to every state in Australia. We've talked to Makita and they all love it, and every place we've been loves it. And about 7 or 8 years ago when we offered it here in this state, you loved it, but you said, we'd rather do it ourselves. So I assume you've got it. I have this ambition to make it a worldwide testing, and I'm talking with the Google and Yahoos of the world to why not put it on there and make it accessible to everyone free and disrupt the whole system. Well, that's going to make me popular with the test systems. And this one here I want to finish on. As measurement people, we're not very good at measuring how we think. We're very good at measuring the outcomes of it. But with these modern test theories that are coming through in the last few years, we're getting a hang of a lot better at using information from tests to start to get feedback stuff to teachers and to kids about what they're doing. Now, I started in a very simple area. Well, I thought it was simple, spelling. Now, where I started is that most teachers, to improve spelling with kids that are struggling, have to have a reasonable knowledge of linguistics. It's just not as simple to say to kids, have more high-frequency words, because that may not be the kid's problem. And I'm looking at Joe here, who knows a hang of a lot more about this than I. There's about 27 rules that we've worked out, linguistic rules, about what kids have. And I've learned words like fricatives and these things, which meant nothing to me before, about the problems that kids have in spelling. And what we developed as a prototype is a way, it took us about 3 hours for every kid, for a kid to go through a series of assessments to work out the errors they were making in spelling. And then we wanted to relate it to now you go to these different sites and you do these lessons to improve your spelling. Now, if you can do it in spelling, why can't you do it in the area that I'm most passionate about? In my early days as a teacher, I was a music teacher. And one of my frustrations, particularly in primary schools, was how poorly it is taught. Now, if you again had backward design about how you would know what music looked like when it was done well in the school using the kind of tools that I've shown you today, I'd hope you'd make a breakthrough. That's where I'd love to go. My bottom line is that if you look at the half-life there in terms of the major breakthroughs in assessment, I think we're on a very exciting moment, that we're going to make a tremendous breakthrough in terms of how we can do the kinds of things I've been outlining you tonight, how we can break through further in terms of the cognitive process, how we can make this, as it is in New Zealand at the moment, at the fingertips of every teacher, every day. How we're starting to move now to a language where we're talking about student assessment capabilities. And I can go into schools where 7-year-olds know how to interpret effect sizes. They know how to interpret results from assessments, and they absolutely know and passionately want to know about where to next, because that's the fundamental argument. And that, for me, folks, is probably my bottom line, where to next. Thank you for listening.
John, thank you for a terrific provocation on teaching and really getting to the essence of what we need to think about in terms of teaching. If you think about these ideas, apart from presenting them with such powerful documentary evidence from all of the work you've done over such a long period, but the ideas of assessment as feedback for teachers, reframing the way we commonly think about these things, is a provocation, and it's a fantastic challenge. And I think one of the things that strikes me about the presentation tonight is there's nobody left untouched in the challenge business, and there's always a growth place to go, whether you are a highly experienced, highly skilled professional teacher who's up the end of the bell curve, adding huge value to people's learning. There's still further value add, or wherever you are in the spectrum. And I think that you really demonstrate that very well for us and keep us challenged. It comes back to my first thinking about feedback, and it's completely engaged me since about the 80s, and how back and forth exchanges are really important in the essence of teaching. The other aspect that struck me tonight in that whole discourse around so many parts of the study is that the student is absolutely in this back and forth exchange, and it is looking for the feedback and using that rather than thinking of it as telling people how they're getting on. And that dynamism, I think, is really at the essence of the provocation of teaching. So, congratulations.
Thank you.
Could I endorse all your comments, Colette? This being the last of the series, there's just 3 people I want to acknowledge who work behind the scenes in all the Dean's lectures. That's Lauren Graham, Natalie Hinton and Katrina May. Can you join with me in thanking them?